How do we understand India's sharp turn on Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine? That's our big focus on the program today. I'm Barkha Dutt, here with the Mojo story. Now, the Foreign Minister, Jaishankar, has expressed what he's called his profound concern at the trajectory of the Ukraine invasion. Earlier, too, the Prime Minister told Vladimir Putin in no uncertain terms that this is not an era of war. Remember, India had actually had to handle a fair degree of criticism from certain quarters after a series of abstentions in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. At the time, the point was made that India must act from our own national interest. Point taken. But clearly, there has been a rethink. Clearly, India's position has more than shifted and evolved. It seems to be a sharp turn. Has Putin conclusively lost the support of Narendra Modi and the support of India? And what are the geopolitical implications of that? Remember, India's, in a sense, dependency on Russia for defense procurement in particular continues. And this statement has come just days after the SCO Summit in Samarkand, where, of course, Prime Minister made those remarks to Putin. Let's introduce our experts on the panel today, a very distinguished panel. Ambassador Vivek Katju, veteran diplomat, is with us. General Hasnain is with us. General Hasnain is back from a prolonged illness, and we're good to see him in true Fauji spirit, hale and hearty. Welcome back, General. Also joining us is veteran diplomat, Ambassador Talmiz, Ahmad, and of course, Dr. Happymon Jacob, strategic affairs analyst and author, is with us. Good to see all of you. So, Ambassador Katju, before I get an initial remark from you, I would like to play out that statement of the foreign minister calling out Russia, calling out China, a lot to unpack there. Let's listen in.
Madam President, the trajectory of the Ukraine conflict is a matter of profound concern for the entire international community. The future outlook appears even more disturbing. The nuclear issue is a particular anxiety. In a globalized world, the impact of the conflict is being felt even in distant regions. We have all experienced its consequences in terms of surging costs and actual shortages of food grains, fertilizers, and fuel. On this score too, there are good grounds to be worried about what awaits us. The global south, especially, is feeling the pain very acutely. We must, therefore, not initiate measures that further complicates the struggling global economy. And that is why India strongly reiterates the need for an immediate cessation of all hostilities and a return to dialogue and diplomacy. Clearly, as Prime Minister Narendra Modi has emphasized, this cannot be an era of war. On our part, we are also providing both humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors under economic stress. Turning to the specific topic before the Council today, let me emphasize that even in conflict situations, there can be no justification for violation of human rights or of international law. Where any such acts occur, it is imperative that they are investigated in an objective and independent manner. This was the position we took with regard to the killings in Bucha, and this is the position we take even today. The Council will also recall that we had then supported calls for an independent investigation into the Bucha incident.
Okay, Ambassador Katju, I'll start with you. This is quite an evolution from the time when we had successive abstentions at the same United Nations. And obviously the cue has been taken from the Prime Minister telling Vladimir Putin in full public gaze for recorded on camera, this is not the era of war. How do you understand our sharp turn on Russia?
I think this is a significant moment in our ties with Russia. But it has been an evolution from February. And please allow me a minute. In February, we used to talk about the security concerns of all states, and that was a clear indication that we understood Russia's concerns with regard to NATO's expansion. Once the Russians invaded Ukraine, the first thing we did was to drop that formulation. And we then started talking about territorial integrity and the sanctity of territorial integrity and sovereignty, something that Jaishankar has reiterated again. We also emphasized the need for cessation of hostilities and the return to negotiations, again, something that Jaishankar has emphasized. But there are two things that are very striking. The first is his sentence on the nuclear aspect. Now, allow me to expand on this. We have Happy, Talmiz, and General Saab with us, and they are far more experienced on these matters. But I'll tell you what I'm seeing as the real issue today. I had thought that a kind of balance had been achieved with the Russians retreating from Kyiv and focusing on eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine and occupying that territory. Also, that food flows had begun, grain supplies had begun, there was a little easing on the fuel energy front, etc. But the Ukrainian advance over the last few weeks obviously has upset this balance. And the real difficulty that I see is this, that till now, the Americans and the West has been very particular that the war has not been taken by Ukraine into Russian territory. That's been clear. They've not supplied any weapon systems which could go into Russian territory. Mm-hmm. However, the real difficulty that I now see is that if following the referendum, the Russians integrate the Donbass region and declare it as part of Russia, that means Russian territory, then just as Crimea has not been attacked so far, what will happen if the Ukrainian expansion and weapons which are being supplied by the West start landing on territory which the Russians now say is Russian territory? That is why the nuclear issue is coming in. Happy is of course an expert in these issues, as is the General Saab and Talmiz are. But my fear is that the warning that Putin is holding out to, and I'm sorry I'm taking a little time, but I think this is important, that Putin is drawing a new red line.
Yeah.
And this new red line is going to put an enormous amount of pressure on the West. He is putting Biden and everyone else in Europe on notice that till now, what was sacrosanct was internationally recognized Russian territory. But now I'm redrawing these lines, even if you don't accept my amalgamation following the referendum, and we know what the referendum will be, of territories of Ukraine, then I'm free to do what I think is necessary in my interest. And that is why this sentence of Jaishankar has leapt out to me, where he talks, I think the exact formulation he used is, the nuclear issue is of particular anxiety.
Yeah.
It is. And there is no easy answer to this.
And if I may now bring in Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, Talmiz Sahab, I remember talking to you in sort of immediate aftermath of several of the abstentions that India associated with not condemning Russia, and you at that time argued that this was a needed corrective to a foreign policy that had gone too close into the arms of the Americans. Now, till the Prime Minister actually publicly said to Putin, this is not the era of war, a lot of us were left wondering, how is India going to walk this tightrope between, attending the SCO Summit with the Russians and the Chinese in Samarkand, and then the Quad on the other side. With our evolved position on Russia now, we seem to have taken a side finally, or do you not think we have even now?
See, my own reading of the situation is this. India espouses strategic autonomy. This has been an article of faith with us for 75 years, that we do not align ourselves with any major power. There has been a misreading in India, in our media and academia, that we are somehow aligned with the Russians just because we did not condemn them. We did not condemn them in a certain context, and we maintained a certain balance. Obviously, certain period has passed on since the war was initiated. New developments have taken place. There has been a massive arming of Ukraine with what we would see as state-of-the-art weaponry, and the scenario seems to be escalating as we go along. India, therefore, has mentioned its concerns. It's mentioned its concerns at a global platform. It has also conveyed its concerns to President Putin personally, face to face. What has the Prime Minister actually said? He said this is not the era for war. I agree with that. We should never have war. There is, in my view as a student of history, what is the era for war? There is no era for war. Is it an era only when Western powers go to war, it becomes an era for war? And when any other conflict takes place, largely instigated by Western expansionism, that is not the era for war? I think that we should not overread the situation. There has been a certain background briefing to our media who have gone berserk, and also the American media have picked up on this phrase. I don't believe that it deserves the extraordinary misleading that has taken place so far. Let us stick with strategic autonomy. We have that.
Which phrase do you think has been overreacted to?
No, you saw the New York Times and Washington Post. They said Modi distances himself from Putin. Mr. Modi rebukes Putin. None of that is valid. They had one of the best conversations that they've ever had, an extraordinarily friendly conversation. And indeed, if you might recall, President Putin agreed with Prime Minister Modi, saying that this is not the era for war. And indeed, you are aware, consistently from the end of February, there have been numerous attempts at a peace process. You are aware of 5 or 6 rounds of the peace process. And who blocked this peace process? Even Western media have said it was British and American intervention directly with President Zelensky that prevented the process that had begun at Istanbul. We are well aware of that.
So do you actually think that India, Ambassador Talmiz, has not distanced itself significantly from the Russians?
Could you repeat your last query? The sound had gone off.
Sorry, I said, are you actually saying that therefore you don't think that there's been a significant disassociation by India from the Russians?
Not really, not really. The relationship that we have with Russia is very old, very substantial, and mutually valuable. Look, I'm not only talking about defense supplies. Defense supplies is obvious. All our weaponry, all our artillery, all our armor comes from the Russians. Yes, there is an issue relating to technology, and we have the right to diversify our sources. But the crucial cooperation that we have with Russia is now age-old and extraordinarily valuable as far as India is concerned. We also have a very substantial energy partnership. In the face of extraordinary Western rebukes and criticisms, India has continued to purchase oil from the Russians and have completely negativated any negative impacts of the so-called embargo that the Western powers have imposed upon Russia. I believe that we have asserted our strategic autonomy, and I believe that is the right course for us.
Okay, so these are two completely differing perspectives that we've heard. Ambassador Katju, before I go to the General Hasnain, do you want to briefly say that do you read it the same way as Ambassador Talmiz? He actually thinks too much has been made about Modi saying to Putin, this is not the era of war. The Russian ambassador, by the way, today said the same thing. He said, Jaishankar is profoundly concerned, so are we.
Look, I have a slightly different take. I respect what Talmiz has said, and he is very knowledgeable in these matters. But I do not recollect a single occasion in our history of relations with Russia when when the top leader of the country said something publicly which could be even remotely construed as critical. If any message had to be given, it was given privately. Talmiz is absolutely right when he says that substantively we have looked after our interests in energy. And I think Jaishankar has forthrightly said that we will look after our interests when it comes to energy, food, or any other issue concerning Russia. But this public comment itself, to me, is unprecedented. I may be wrong,
Yeah.
and if I'm wrong, I will be very happy if my old colleague Talmiz corrects me.
Okay.
But never in the entire history of India's Russian relations has any leader ever made a comment which could be construed, misconstrued, misperceived in a manner that would provide a shoulder to other leaders to fire guns off. They are doing it wrongly, but we've never done this. So that, to my mind, is unprecedented.
That's a very important
Talmiz
point
can
because
correct me if I'm wrong.
I'll go back to Ambassador Talmiz, but I need to get the others. General Hasnain, two very, very differing perspectives there. And Ambassador Katju and Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad do agree on one thing. The world certainly picked up that comment by Prime Minister Modi. Front page on the New York Times, Macron quoting it, right? It's a kind of, the Mexicans are now talking about it. So it's a comment that certainly went globally viral, and world leaders took their cue from that comment to make a point about India's shift. I think one of the headlines said in the Foreign Affairs Journal, Putin is losing India. That was the headline. General Hasnain, your take.
Barkha, give me a minute on this. This is a very, very interesting thing. And I know I'm treading a very, very fine path here between two of India's most outstanding diplomats. Let me say that, right? I think, first of all, the SCO was not expected to do much. No one was really expecting this kind of a thing to emerge from the SCO. Of course, the presence of Russia, the presence of China was there. India, of course, was there also a very important, significant power. To my mind, this whole thing between the two great diplomats of ours is a perceptional issue. I mean, you can veer either side and say both are right. Absolutely. To my mind, this could not have happened by surprise. I'm sure there was a background check to it. There was a slight brief on it, which must have been given to the Russians. And Mr. Putin couldn't have been taken by surprise all of a sudden. I mean, if you really look at the optics of it all, the thing was all live and shown. It didn't appear that it shocked him out of the skin suddenly. As Mr. Katju very correctly says, Ambassador Katju very correctly says, we've never had a history of this kind of a confrontation with Russia. Perhaps Mr. Putin would have been very surprised. I think he was well briefed about it. And I think India's stance is really not a change. It is just a conveyance. It's a communication of international concern. And it comes out of India's rising strategic confidence. If you really look at the last 3 years, India has not been strategically very confident. You know, the pandemic hit us, the economy was down completely. I mean, we had a confrontation going on in Ladakh, all kinds of things. But this year, there has been a resurgence. And India is coming back. These kind of statements come from nations which are more confident. We are confident of our relationship with the Russians. We are definitely more confident of our relationship with the West and with NATO, and with what Ambassador Katju very correctly perceives and writes and says, this whole issue of the nuclear confrontation, there were hints going on. There were operations going around nuclear plants. This kind of thing doesn't happen in the world. These kind of risks don't take place. And it is veering towards a kind of a nuclear confrontation. The NATO does not have the doctrines to be able to respond correctly to this. Theirs is all or nothing. That is the kind of response they normally look at. So India is concerned, and India's strategic confidence is on the rise, and I think this was the most appropriate time to make the statement. The coming of Mr. Narendra Modi on the international stage. Everyone knows that he is a huge leader, a leader of 1.4 billion people. Obviously, a stage has to come where that confidence has to manifest into international affairs. And obviously, New York Times and Washington Post, the Western media, which is going berserk on information warfare, was looking for these hints. They got it and they exploited it.
Do you think, before I get in Happymon, do you think, General Hasnain, that it was a radical shift? It didn't feel any more like a slow evolution. I should caveat my question by saying that Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad is not at all convinced that that one sentence actually marked a departure. So we need to keep that in mind. Therefore, I'm asking you.
I tend to agree with Ambassador Talmiz. I tend to agree with him. It is not a manifest change in Indian policy. It was something which was there, and India was very, very concerned about what's happening in Ukraine. It was having its effect internationally on the energy security, on international economic security, and everything. India is concerned about that. It had to express itself. And therefore, I think it's just a slight tweaking of the Indian public policy, to say. It's just a little tweak. Nothing more.
Okay. Happymon, do you think it's just a tweak? I also remember that we were literally, can we just mute Happymon till I ask my question? Yeah. We were abstaining at every, like the most basic resolutions at the UN. We started changing our position when we voted in favor of Zelensky being allowed to address the United Nations. Then comes the Modi-Putin meeting. Now come Jaishankar's remarks. Happy, how do you see it?
Barkha, the article that you just quoted from Foreign Affairs that Russia is losing India is actually written by me, so I must.
See, then I read the right things. But yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So it's not written by an American; it's written by me to begin with. I think I'm completely in agreement with what Ambassador Katju said. I think there is a slow evolution of India's position as far as Russia-Ukraine is concerned. To begin with, as Ambassador Katju correctly pointed out, you are looking at a 2014 formulation vis-a-vis Crimea, when India said there are legitimate interests on both sides. We don't hear that anymore. And
Sorry, we can't hear you. I think, Happymon, we can't hear you. We're going to ask you to reconnect. But I think it has been pointed out to me that the Foreign Affairs article I was quoting from was actually written by Dr. Happymon Jacob, and the headline of it actually said, Putin is losing India. And we'll take it back to Happy. I'm going to ask you to reconnect. Please, can we ask Happy to reconnect? I want to go back to Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad in the meantime. Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, you said too much was made of that one remark when Prime Minister Modi says to Vladimir Putin, this is not the era of war. But what about the other comments? What about the foreign minister since saying, this is of profound concern to us? What about the fact that we have voted for once saying Zelensky should be allowed to speak at the UN? There have been other significant changes, and do respond to what Ambassador Katju said, that in his memory, he can't remember a single other time when a public comment like this would have been made to the Russians.
I do agree that much has changed in the global order. I see the present conflict as an occasion for the West to reaffirm the old world order, which has got Western hegemony as its defining feature. And I see that they perceive a challenge coming in from the rising powers, China, Russia, India, and various other powers. They want to preserve the old world order. And hence, this is a ruthless war. As far as they are concerned, they are not going to give up this kind of confrontation. Where does it leave us? They will look for every sentence and phrase to see that they can get some plus points here. I had mentioned to you that when Prime Minister made his remark that this is not the era for war, President Putin agreed with him. And they had a 45-minute meeting, which was extraordinarily warm and cordial. And that was manifest. It was visible to all observers that it was extremely cordial. So let us not get carried away by this Western propaganda that has been unleashed upon us and that shows no sign of abating. Where are we now? As far as I can see, India is committed to strategic autonomy. What the pro-US votaries are seeking is to somehow shift India towards the American camp. This is not going to happen. India is far too wise a country to be pushed around in this way or that way. Now, if you see Mr. Happymon Jacob's article, which I read with great care, he also is on the one hand, on the other hand kind of approach. You see, this is the problem with academia. They make a certain case and then at the last minute they back off, because he concludes his article by saying, still the Moscow-New Delhi relationship has enough ballast not to sink in the immediate future, nor will India make a decisive break with Russia anytime soon. And earlier in the article, he says that this break might come, but it might take years to come. So I am not impressed with this kind of academic writing. Either you have one view or you have another view. This kind of on the one hand, on the other hand, covers you all the way and gets you nowhere. I don't agree with the content of the article. I don't believe that it serves any useful purpose. And I think that we should keep our balance here. There is nothing fundamentally changing as far as India is concerned. There is a real challenge to existing order, but it is not coming from the Indian side. India is committed to the strategic partnership that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, now you've said a lot, including about Dr. Happymon Jacob's article, which we're going to actually pull up on the screen. There it is. Russia is losing India. Happy, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take away the credit. I remember reading the article, the headline stayed with me. The author's byline should have stayed with me as well. But Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad is not impressed. He's not impressed. Now, I want you to respond both to his points as well as his larger argument about Western propaganda. Go ahead.
Barkha, let me make it very clear. A careful reading of my article will conclusively tell you that I'm making the argument that Russia is losing India. I am not making a on the one hand, on the other hand argument. In fact, the concluding line is that India may not toe the Western line, but India is actually going to jump the line. That's the argument. So there is no mistaking of where I stand. There is no confusion as far as where I am standing. That's number one. Number two, I mean, call it Western propaganda, call it what you want. I see absolutely no reason as to why we in India should bend over backwards to support an invasion being carried out by President Putin against Ukraine. Why should we do that? I see absolutely no reason for doing that, number one. And number two, as Ambassador Katju correctly pointed out, we are looking, and I'm merely describing things here. I'm not trying to prescribe anything. I'm saying that there is a change in the Indian stand as far as Ukraine and Russia is concerned. I think anyone who is looking at it carefully will see that. And let's come to the question of strategic autonomy and non-alignment. What is strategic autonomy? Strategic autonomy is the ability of a country to choose for itself what is in its national interest. So are we saying that supporting Russia on the Ukraine war is in our national interest? Absolutely not. I think the reality is that had the Russians won the war quite immediately, quite quickly, perhaps we would have sort of played the balancing game. And I think the goalpost has changed. India's national interest has changed. This war is dragging on, and this is going to sort of drag us down to it. So however you may look at it, the reality is that India has made the right decision by clearly distancing itself from the misadventure of President Putin. I think I see absolutely no confusion about it.
I am just fascinated by this conversation because there are such differing layered perspectives of the same set of developments. So Dr. Happymon, there's your article with your byline, and you reject the suggestion that this is a on one hand, on the other hand argument.
No, very clear. What I'm trying to say, very clear. I'm saying that India is moving on. India will move on. I'm not saying it's happening. It's happening tomorrow. That's called a layered perspective. There's nothing called academic dilly-dallying here. I'm sorry.
I don't understand. Where are we moving towards?
Okay.
I don't see any evidence of any movement at any time. We are where we were. We pursue our national interest. and we take certain positions in our favor, but we are not moving anywhere. We are moving where we were pursuing strategic autonomy. We are not moving in the direction of the Americans. We are not going to be aligned with the Americans. There is no advantage, no strategic advantage for India in this kind of alignment that the votaries of the American camp are pushing upon us.
May I come in now? The others must respond to this heated discussion. Ambassador Katju and then General Hasnain. Sorry, General Hasnain, I was going to come to you, but Ambassador Katju has his hand up, so I'll start with him. Ambassador Katju, please.
No, I entirely agree with Talmiz. India has to pursue its national interests at all times. And our national interests demand that decisions are made in Delhi. That is the essence of strategic autonomy, that we don't listen, that we don't come under pressure. And I do believe that right from Jawaharlal Nehru's time, India has shown the ability to withstand pressure and chart its own course. Now, we may disagree, and I also agree with Talmiz, and Happy is my very, very dear friend, but not perhaps in this article. I must confess, I've been rather lazy. I have not read this article, which I will. But academics are inclined to, on the one hand, on the other, and that Happy will agree with me. Perhaps.
But hang on, you are saying you
haven't read a different kind of academic. But the major point I'm making is slightly different. The major point I'm making is that diplomacy is changed. Indian diplomacy is showing a nuanced difference. It is not the question of pursuit of strategic interests. That, of course, is a constant. That's a permanent thing. But your perceptional diplomacy is giving rise, which it never did in the past, to provide ammunition to those who want to take advantage in a particular situation.
Except that you say that you agree. You say that you agree with Ambassador Talmiz, but you actually fundamentally, both of you have disagreed on this.
No. We have not disagreed.
Can I say how? Can I say how I think you disagreed?
May I reiterate my point of view just very swiftly?
Yes.
We've evolved our position, which is an obvious fact. Talmiz, I'm sure Talmiz, as Talmiz would have done, he would have read the text of our statements in the Security Council. We stopped talking about Russian security interests, which we always did in the past. That's a matter of record. Before the invasion of Ukraine and after the invasion of Ukraine, our formulations changed. So I'm not saying anything which I cannot corroborate with the record.
Okay, General Hasnain.
So there has been this evolution, and that evolution is part of the maintenance of your strategic autonomy.
Got it.
We are not static.
Okay, General Hasnain.
Ending discussions between such great diplomats and a great academic here with us, no doubt. Let me try and bring in a slightly different angle to this. Realpolitik. In the sense that if anyone is observing what is happening in Ukraine between, say, about the 30th of August and the 5th of September, would know that this so-called counteroffensive, which I don't call a counteroffensive, I call it a riposte, because this is not a huge kind of an offensive which has taken place from Ukraine, has emanated in the end of August. And it is becoming very evident, if anyone is reading, if Mr. Modi has had advisors coming and speaking to him, telling him the unwinnability of this war. Who can win this war? No one can win this war, right? I mean, if the West thinks that this is a counteroffensive at their behest that the Ukrainians have launched, and that is going to lead to a final confrontation and a victory on the battlefield, they've got something else coming to them. The whole of the East, the whole of the South is still very much with the Russians, right? So the realpolitik is that this war can continue for the next 5 years. It can continue for the next 10 years. There can be nothing. There is nothing, no outcomes of it as such. It's only going to affect energy. It's going to affect international economics. It's going to affect international social dynamics, all things of that kind. So this is the reality which India is speaking. And I think India is very correct in that. No one else has spoken out in this matter. The Chinese have also spoken, but they haven't spoken in such a transparent kind of a way, in the manner in which Mr. Modi has spoken. That is why I mentioned right at the beginning that this is the talk of a more confident nation, a nation which has emerged from 3 years of very, very difficult times. And now we are on the international strategic stage. We are making a difference. Well, our statements are being exploited by the Western media, etc., is a different matter. That's a different matter completely. But I don't think fundamentally our position has changed.
Okay, but let me take this back to Dr. Happymon, and then we'll start taking last comments. As he said, it may have been published in Foreign Affairs, but it was written by an Indian, namely Dr. Happymon himself. When you say Russia is losing India, you have written this. So this cannot be called Western propaganda. But let me reverse the question. Can India afford to lose Russia? Can, given the fact of subsidized purchases of energy, given the dependency on defense procurement, given the fact that we need to maintain a certain check and balance in the global order?
In the month of January this year, our oil purchases from Russia was negligible. In the month of April, it went up to about 800,000 barrels a day. In the month of May, it went up to 1 million barrels a day. It's now coming down. Why did we start purchasing from Russia? It is because we are getting discounts. So India is not dependent on Russian oil. That's absolutely inaccurate. If that was the case, we'd have done the same kind of purchases last year, number one. Number two, between 2012 and 2021, India's dependence on Russian arms came down by 47%. So we are diversifying, actually. So we need the Russians for two things. One, to help India at the UN Security Council should there be discussions on XYZ issues, and number two, in order for Russia to continue to give us the defense equipment, and we are diversifying. And why shouldn't India diversify? I think as a country that should look after its own national interest, India should continue to diversify as far as its energy supplies. In any case, we don't depend on Russia for energy supplies, and as far as the arms supplies are concerned. And as far as the support on the UNSC is concerned, I think what we are forgetting here is the China factor. Now, I think it serves no national interest as far as India is concerned to forget the China challenge next door. The reason why India is calibrating its balance of power considerations is because you have a next door threat called China. And with China on board, I am not so sure going forward a few years down the line, a war-fatigued Russia will be able to make independent decisions on regional geopolitics or global geopolitics vis-a-vis India without China interfering in that. So I think any discussion on Russia should not take place without accounting for China, the biggest threat next door. Call me a Western propagandist. I don't care, but the reality is that there is China, and I think we should wake up to that.
Okay. Okay, General Hasnain, very quickly, I need to start taking closing comments. I just want your thought on the defense relationship. It remains critical. Yes, I take Happy's point about the diversification, but it does remain critical. In fact, I was seeing an article this morning in the papers on semiconductors as just another thing that that we need from India. And of course, Happy, I didn't say that we depend on Russia for energy. I said we've purchased, discounted, or I use the word subsidized at subsidized prices. Go ahead, General Hasnain.
Opportunistic discount purchases.
Actually, the S-400, symbolically, the S-400 deal is perhaps the most important thing visually, right? We still haven't received all the equipment that we need. It is something which is very critical for us for our air defense requirements of the northern borders and places like that. So this, despite Atmanirbharta and everything, is going to take time. And we are hugely dependent on the Russians, there's no doubt. But I do think that our relationship has matured a lot. It's not as if we are blindly dependent only on the Russians, and the Russians also realize it. They also realize the strategic importance of India as a part of this overall confrontation with the West. So I do think this relationship is moving on. I fully agree with Ambassador Vivek Katju that our relationship with Russia is so important. In the past, we have never ever spoken against it. But I think mature nations, developing nations of this kind, these relationships move on and they develop. And that's exactly what we are looking at the moment. I still continue to believe we have not fundamentally changed our policy.
Okay, Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, leaving aside, a kind of Western media pouncing on those remarks, how far has India's own position evolved, according to you, on the invasion of Ukraine?
I have not seen that evolution. Yes, there has been a certain substantive content to the remarks that our foreign minister has made at the UN. I think they have been well read. They are balanced. When he speaks of human rights abuses, I think he has not identified any particular country. When he speaks of international law, he has not identified any particular country. We have articulated earlier, Russia's legitimate security concerns, about which we are fully aware. Our own officials fully know about the larger game plan that is now being worked out at the global level between the Americans on the one side and the other emerging powers on the other. We are aware of that. And we know that there is a much larger issues that go beyond Ukraine. Ukraine is only a kind of temporary theater for this larger conflict. There are also serious issues pertaining to the US domestic scenario and the elections that are coming up in November. And therefore, we see a lot of posturing that is going on in the US media on this subject. The 2 points that I would like to ask our pro-US apologists is this. What is the role of the US with regard to our
I think that's an outrageous. I think that's
I'm not referring to anybody by name.
It's an outrageous.
I'm not referring to
My
anybody
assistant
by
diplomat,
name.
I'm not going to take this nonsense.
I do not
refer to anybody by name. If the cap fits, wear it. My point is very separate.
He has no right to
My point is very
Of
specific.
course,
What is the
He has got his role.
role?
Never called him any
I
name.
can't
Shall we
hear.
be
I'm
handling?
trying to speak.
What
Sir,
is
sir,
the
sir,
purported
can you
US
please-
role
This
with
is
regard
outrageous.
to our problems
May
with
I just
China?
jump in?
I
I'm
would
trying
like
jump
to
in
know
here.
that. I've never heard
No, I mean,
anybody
you're not
tell me.
Okay, I'm trying. I can't actually hear
For a
myself.
diplomat of your stature, that is outrageous and shameful.
I have not referred to anybody by name. I
I'm
have
sorry.
not said
You-
anything,
I'm
and I have
sorry.
not
Nobody's-
referred to
nobody's-
you by
nobody's
name.
stupid
I
here.
know you well, and
didn't.
we don't need to call each other. I have
No, I
referred
didn't.
in
You did.
general. I have
Doctor-
referred in general
Ambassador
to the
Talmiz,
US
to make-
pro-US apologists
to
in
have
our
a
media
substantive, to
and
have a
academia.
substantive. Okay, can I just
Yeah.
speak?
My
To have a-
substantive point is this.
1 minute. Can I just speak? I just want to calm everybody down. Happymon, I don't think Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad was making a personal reference to you. If he was, I would have jumped in. Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad, can you please say that this was not a reference to Dr. Happymon, so we
I
can
have
return to the
clarified.
substance
This is nothing
of the
to do with
conversation?
Mr. Happymon Jacob,
Okay.
who is a very
Okay.
respected academic, and I know
Thank
him
you.
well, and I have
Thank
been
you.
interviewed by him earlier. I have very
Thank
high
you.
regard and respect
Okay,
for him.
okay, Happymon,
I
now
have
please,
referred
I think
to-
now let's,
I hope
having
I have
put that on
referred to
record, make your
pro-US
substantive point.
apologists in our
Yeah.
media whose tribe is huge. Let us go forward. I want to know this pro-US alignment that is being advocated by this group. Where will it take us vis-a-vis our issues with China? Has anybody ever mentioned that this is what the US role is likely to be in terms of our handling issues relating to China? Second point, there is a suggestion, and that is there in Mr. Happymon Jacob's article as well, that somehow the US and France are supposed to support us in the Security Council and possibly replace Russia. My question, France and the US and many other Western powers have very serious positions with regard to religious freedom, respect for human rights, respect for minorities, respect for lower caste and various other. Very frequently, they are extremely intrusive as far as our domestic scenario is concerned. And I'm not sure that they are going to be particularly helppful as far as the
Okay.
Security Council or any other platform is concerned. So I have raised these two questions, and I leave it to your panel to sort of
Okay,
clarify matters
I was going
if they
to.
wish to.
Okay, I was going to give Ambassador Katju the last word, but I'll let Dr. Happymon Jacob intercede there if he'd like to with any comment. Dr. Happymon, would you like to respond, please? And then I'll give Ambassador Katju. Yeah.
Thank you, Barkha. I will simply say that not supporting Russia and its aggression against Ukraine does not automatically mean that you are getting into an alliance with the United States of America or the West. I think that is a wrong assumption. It is not as black and white. We have, as a country that should take its own decisions on various things, it is important that we make sure that we clarify our position on Ukraine. And that's exactly what the government has done. And I'm completely in support of what the government has done, said so far on Russia and Ukraine. In the article, I am not advocating something, I'm describing something. And my description is that Russia and India are no longer or natural partners. That is exactly what I'm saying in my article. And that's a description, that is not a prescription. Thank you.
Okay. Ambassador Katju, I have to say this program is more heated than the discussions in the United Nations General Assembly, and that's okay, as long as we all end and walk away from it with a smile and with no hard feelings. Last word to you. Yes.
Look, I think we are all patriots here.
Of course.
And that we all have India's interests at heart. We can have different perceptions on how to pursue India's interests, but we have the same objective, which is India's interests. Second, I agree that there is still an enormous coincidence of interests in many areas between India and Russia. There's no doubt about it. And third, that our policy till now has been not to come under any Western pressure vis-a-vis the continuance of our relationship in critical areas with Russia. And we've demonstrated that in energy supplies. And I think Jaishankar was very eloquent in defending that in various fora. Fourth, I don't think we've liked the what Russia calls its military action, but which is an invasion of Ukraine. Now, next, there was a great deal of provocation of Russia. There's no doubt about it. If you see the last 20 years, Putin was provoked time and again. And there is much justification in the Russian view that the West reneged on every commitment it had made at the time of the German reunification. There is absolutely no doubt about it. But having said that, for a P5 member to invade a country the way Russia did is something that I find was unacceptable. There were other ways of signaling it. The Russians decided. Now, and this is what brings me the last point. Now, and that is, I wish Happy and Talmiz and General Saab had commented on it. I now see a very dangerous situation emerging. And that, I'm reiterating this point, that once Russia amalgamates Donbass into its territory, then with the threat, and which Jaishankar has picked up, and he has said, I'm repeating these words because these are very important. He says the nuclear issue is a particular anxiety. Why has he said this? It is not in the context of the plant. It is in the context of if the Russians now object to supplies of weapons to Ukraine, which can be through which the Ukrainians target the Donbass region, then there are imponderables which have a direct bearing on European and international peace and security.
Okay.
That is why I'm saying this is a very dangerous moment in international affairs. I hope it passes.
Yeah, General Hasnain, last word to you, sir. Hang on, sir, you're on mute. General Hasnain's on mute.
Much more to add to this, except that the last word which Mr. Katju has just mentioned. Yes, I do tend to agree with him. And my statement about confrontations around nuclear plants was only hints. Mr. Katju, these were only hints that the Russians are prepared to risk. And actually, this substantially adds to your point, that the Russians are willing to risk. This is the communication which is being done. And yes, we are at a very dangerous moment. I do think Mr. Jaishankar's presence at New York at the moment is a very critical presence. He's one of the few people in this world who understands this extremely well. A professional diplomat, as a political minister today, this is a very rare thing. And I think India is due to play a very important role in this entire situation.
Well, as they say, watch this space at the moment with Putin calling for partial mobilization.
Barkha, please, Barkha, it's important that you allow me one sentence.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
In the past, and perhaps I'm old-fashioned, and perhaps I'm getting in my dotage, we played our diplomacy more subtly and behind the scenes. I'll not say anything further.
That needs another show on the changing nature of Indian diplomacy. But thank you, gentlemen, Ambassador Talmiz, Ahmad, Dr. Happymon, Jacob, Ambassador Katju, General Hasnain. Thank you. Watch this space. I was just making the point that we didn't get to speak about it, but Russians are leaving in the droves as Putin is talking about partial mobilization, and we really have to see how this evolves. But yes, that statement, that referencing of a nuclear threat, a nuclear confrontation is really what the world, everybody needs to be paying more attention to. We leave it there. Thank you so much, and thanks to our audience. See you tomorrow. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.